Next up in the land of poking things with reckless abandon, we have the Poison Javelins, two skills that are severely underestimated by most Javazon players in Diablo 2 because they're, well, poison damage. But the reality is they make exceptional secondary damage sources and can, at least at higher levels, be a primary damage source to bring down a lot of enemies at a reasonable speed, especially if you pair them with the Plague Barbarian Mercenary. Now, before we go in, I know my monkey brain is going to try to mix up Poison and Plague at least once while recording the audio for this. Just know that Poison is the one that just makes a single stream, while Plague explodes whenever it reaches its destination. It's just pretty common for me to mix them up when I'm talking off the cuff. That out of the way, this does give them different strategies, so let's start with the lower level Poison Javelin. This one deals poison damage both with the actual javelin you launch, as well as the clouds it leaves behind. And while there is some debate as to what the best strategy with it is, I personally prefer throwing the javelin either through an opening and having enemies converge on the clouds, or to just fire it off in the direction I want to go and allow the enemies to follow me through the trail. Though the important part is that I want the enemies to deal with as many clouds as possible, rather than just having maybe one puff come off because I impaled an enemy at a yard away from me. Now, as you get pierced, this is less of a problem, but even still, this skill has little to no benefit from impact unless you're running a very specific venom-centered build that can condense off-skill poison damage on the spear hit. And no, poison damage from charms, gear, etc. will not add to the damage of the clouds, just the spear. The only ways to increase it on the clouds are the obvious levels in the skill itself, as well as the sources of +% skill damage and -% enemy resistances, such as the lower resist from Plague Swords we mentioned earlier on a Mercenary, or by hot swapping to something like a Death's Web or Grief on your secondary weapon slot, prior to the enemy getting hit by the poison. Though with both of these skills, doing that quick swap is going to be a major pain. Sure, it's more optimal, but it's far too much juggling for me to recommend it for actual normal play unless you are a high APM player, which is generally restricted to people who are really hardcore into genres like MOBAs and real-time strategy. Now, all that said, Plague Javelin has the Area of Effect, which does change the optimal play, since while you can still do the sort of awkward firewall technique we do with the Poison Javelin, it also opens up better crowd poisoning by combining Pierce and these explosions, meaning there are actually a few legitimate reasons to sometimes hit enemies with it, especially in areas like cows where they are tightly clumped. This bigger area of effect may add more value to that swap we mentioned earlier, but even still, it's something still best reserved for hard targets like act bosses and such, that just don't go down quickly to poison in general, so you pretty much want to focus on having that +% damage from gear like Trangul's gloves instead of other things to really punch it up, which in the damage previews on here, I'm not wearing for obvious reasons, because needless to say, they do help a lot because it's a big boost without increasing duration, but it does give an oddly skewed reflection of the actual damage of the skill. Which does bring us to the elephant in the room. Poison is a damage over time skill, which means in many cases it will kill things slower. And unless you have a really high level kind of setup, a better strategy in some places would be to sweep through poisoning everything on a path and then pick up the drops on the way back down the path, since it may take a few seconds of the several second duration for it to do enough damage for the kill. You really only stop seeing this at truly high-end gear, sadly. Though that said, the skills are helped by the fact that this is at most a 41-point investment, 20 for each of the skills and 1 for a prerequisite between them, meaning you can dip into this and get it up to reasonable damage while still having plenty of points to go for quite a few other builds, with a classic popular combo being Freezing Arrow with Plague Javelin on weapon swap, giving you solid cold and poison damage. You could also go physical with Plague, or you could go Charge Strike with Plague, but having a slightly weaker synergy game since Charge Strike is still, well, fairly synergy heavy even after the 2.4 changes, taking over 80 points to max out. So, do you have any favorite pairings that take advantage of the cheap synergies of Plague and Poison Javelin? Or do you prefer sticking it to the ever-popular Pure Lightning Amazon build? Mention it down below, and if you want to know more about the physical Javelin skills, check out the video on screen now, and tell me if I mixed up Plague and Poison Javelin at least once here.